Ishka, Ganner, thank you very much. So beautiful and so very meaningful too. Thank you. Well, Shabbat Shalom to everybody joining us today. Great to see you even on screen, whether with video on or off. This Shabbat morning, I was tempted to talk about the return of baseball. And I'll be starting a vacation this coming week that will very likely include some serious baseball watching. But somehow even the national pastime does not measure up to this summer's two competing narratives. The effects of living through the global pandemic of COVID-19 and an awakening to the systemic issues of racism that linger from the founding of this country. I wasn't specifically planning on doing so, but I felt called, I felt a need to share my last midsummer sermon on that second topic, which each of us has considered and some have found ways to meaningfully act on, even when we have been mostly stuck at home. And the reason I feel called to this theme is related to where we are in the Torah. Recently, I mentioned how surprised I always am when Miriam dies and then Aaron dies toward the end of the book of Bamidbar. Who takes over for Aaron? Who takes over for Miriam? Most people cannot answer the first one. It's his son, Elazar. And there's no absolutely clear answer for the second other than women leaders and heroes, both quiet and out front in every generation, who have sustained and perpetuated our people. Who takes over for Moses? That at least most Bible-aware people do know. It will be soon enough Yoshua ben Nun, Joshua the son of Nun, who succeeds Moses and leads the people into the promised land. And a line about Joshua in this week's Parsha gives us some insight into why. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs writes a wonderful weekly Torah column called Covenant and Conversation. Not for the first time, he quoted from a TED Talk, this one by Derek Sivers, with a duration of all of 3 minutes. In it, he answers in less than that how to start a movement. How do you start a movement? It is not to lead, but to inspire a follower. As Sivers puts it, it is the first follower who transforms a lone nut into a leader. Even more profoundly, he makes the solid claim that new followers emulate the follower, not the leader. Followership, as Rabbi Sachs and others call it, followership is its own form of irreplaceable, indispensable accomplishment. Did you know that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day of the same year, and that they happened to be July 4th, 1826, which was the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence? I thought of that while we became aware in the past 2 weeks that 3 of the main followers of Dr. Martin Luther King died, and 2 died on the very same day. And to juxtapose their losses after reasonably long and uncommonly accomplished lives leads to reflecting on what it means to be not just a good leader, but what it means to be a good follower. It was the first follower who transformed that lone visionary into a leader. This was true for Moses, for Washington, for King, and others whose lives counted even more because someone else was inspired to follow in their footsteps, even as their path forward was forged in their own individual way. Who were they, these followers who made and then became leaders through their followership and inspired millions along the way? On July 17th, the Reverend C.T. Vivian died at 95 years old. He marched and worked alongside King, leading in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, later on founding his own anti-racism organization. On that very same day, Congressman John Lewis died at 80 years old, having been recently diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Charles Evers, whose brother Medgar was killed for his activism and who was himself an advocate and the first Black mayor in the history of the state of Mississippi, died just 5 days after these two giants. A duration of less than 1 week felt to many like a transition, both symbolically and practically, in the leadership of the movement for racial and indeed all forms of justice. That it took place in such a tumultuous and unsettled time led to the inescapable conclusion that voices such as theirs will be missed even more intensely than they otherwise might have been. John Lewis is surely most familiar to both the country and to the Jewish community, with which he was very close and in whom he saw fellow travelers on the road toward freedom and justice. As both a symbol and as a continually active presence for every just cause of equality and the ending of discrimination that there is, he never lost his early energy, his drive, his commitment to teach by example. His own pathway forward began as a quintessential follower who helped to make a visionary into a leader. As we heard in Lunch and Learn this week, now on hiatus until the month of Elul begins, Congressman Lewis had a close relationship with the Jewish community. He rejected anti-Semites. He refused to march with them, associate with them, or otherwise lend them his name. It was for this reason that he did not participate in the Million Man March. Yet he also preached forgiveness, reaching across the aisle for partners with whom he did not agree on everything, but with whom he could agree on enough to fuel progress. AIPAC called him a steadfast ally of the Jewish state who was instrumental in gaining passage of the Jerusalem Embassy Act. He spoke at many Jewish community and specifically many AJC events, as well as at the 2012 convention of the Rabbinical Assembly, a gathering I was privileged to attend. Thankfully, the video of his talk there exists in good quality. Just Google John Lewis Rabbinical Assembly and you'll find it, but not right now, please. He tells part of his story, including how he wrote a letter to King as a young man offering to serve. Before long, he was at the center of many nonviolent protests, voter registration drives, and active advocacy for policy and legal change. He was the youngest speaker at the March on Washington. He is in the picture with King and Heschel as they marched in Selma. And you know that at 25, he was beaten badly on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma on Bloody Sunday. Years later, that bridge would become a place to remind America of the accomplishments and unmet goals of a movement that he followed and then led. in the footsteps of King, but on his own path, Lewis led that movement with his preacher's voice, endless charm, endearing friendliness, and as his congressional colleague and our neighbor, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, said, with an immeasurable amount of loving kindness. In a conference call with a number of his congressional colleagues hosted by the American Jewish Committee, each said basically the same thing, sometimes using this very same words. It is what Lewis himself said in innumerable interviews when asked what message he would want others to absorb from his work. He had a catchphrase of how important it is to sometimes get into good trouble, necessary trouble. And his mantra, if he had one, was this: remain focused, do not give up. As he tweeted in 2018, don't get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. He lent his authoritative voice to almost every issue of inequality, including anti-Semitism. The former director of the AJC's Atlanta office recalled a trip to Moscow Lewis participated in on behalf of refuseniks. The participants were briefed to not speak to the authorities about the plight of the Jews in Russia. Lewis spoke up anyway. He had no patience, in a good way. That was something else that represented his complete dedication to the fights of his life. Most of Parashat Devarim consists of Moses retelling the narrative of the spies, with some slight differences from the version told in the book of Bamidbar. But one detail that Moses leaves in, and in fact emphasizes, is that God has appointed Joshua, one of two spies who returned with a positive report, to succeed Moses and lead the people into the land. And in a verse that is easy to overlook, Moses asks the people to imbue him with strength. For he, Joshua, shall allot that strength to Israel. Joshua's strength will depend on your investment and trust in him. And in turn, he will invest that and more back in you, in your well-being, and in your success. Joshua's capacities included both inspiring others and being inspired by them. And both directions of inspiration would be needed after Moses was gone. There were other candidates to succeed Moses, and I hadn't really thought of that before Rabbi Sachs pointed it out. The zealous and dedicated Pinchas, perhaps, or Kalev, the other positive reporting spy. But Joshua was chosen. Rabbi Sachs surmises another reason why. Joshua, in serving Moses throughout the wilderness years, was a role model of what it is to be a follower. That the Israelites needed to learn. Joshua was, in a way, that first follower, certainly Moses' closest follower, who turned that first, no, not that first nut, but that first leader, prophet, and teacher into a leader. The beginning of Deuteronomy is the beginning of a deserved and extended farewell to Moses. His leadership, his example, and his enduring legacy form the foundation of our Torah. Yet an overlooked but indispensable manifestation of all three of those traits is that he would be followed by those who would then inspire others to follow them, and on and on and on until us. Perhaps on a week when we affirm Joshua's strength as a follower, which made him a better leader, and a week of saying goodbye and thank you to John Lewis, whose dedication as a follower also made him an inspiring leader, we can affirm that great leadership is critical. but great followership is irreplaceable. I wish you a very safe, healthy, and meaningful next couple of weeks. And since I finally have all Yankee and Red Sox fans on mute, let's go Mets. Shabbat Shalom.